Hello. So there's something I want to talk about. Obviously, I'm here and I'm talking, so there is something I want to talk about. So the the thing between representational art and abstract art, there's some indicators on the the one form of art against the other. I'm just spitballing here. So there's an excellent book I think anyone involved with art, especially with modern art, should read, and it's Ian Gibson's biography on Salvador Dali, The Shameful Life of Salvador Dali. It's quite a good book, quite revealing. But one of the things that and it's been a while since I've read the book, but one of the things that kept standing out in my thinking was the public's general attitude towards Salvador Dali's work and the attitude of his peers to his work in regard to the weird transition that followed World War II. So if you look at some of his, and I'm not providing any examples, you see me drawing on the screen, and that's just how this is going to be for the time being. Prior to World War II, Salvador Dali's artwork was more abstract. It was more in line with the surrealist movement. And here's the weird thing about that. So in kind of historical, because when you look at art and the history of art, you have to align that with historical movements in politics and in culture. You can't just look at artwork as a piece of artwork. You have to look at it in context with the world as a whole. And it's not to have any criticisms of artwork. You have to do artwork, or you have to be an artist, or you have to be a historian. You just have to take into account that there is a symbiotic effect. There's a symbiotic cultural relationship between the environment and the art that's produced. I imagine that's pretty obvious. But the surrealists weren't so much an art movement as they were kind of a political action. They were relatively socialistic. Um, there were some who would be classified as members of communist parties. I think the anti-fascist or counter-fascist movements in Spain during Franco's dictatorship of Spain, they would be classified as socialists. It doesn't matter. It was well represented in the artwork created by the surrealists and the Dadaists, and they had offshoots of the Fauve movement, which, if you look at crazy kid cartoons nowadays, they have more in relationship with the Fauvists, which I think is French for beast. They would be the ones that painted purple giraffes and lavender skies, and really, I think they would have created the expressionist movement. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So the relatively, not very, but the relatively abstract nature of surrealist and Dadaist work was relatively prevalent as kind of an underground. And Salvador Dali broke from this group. It's either he broke from this group or he was pushed out. I don't recall. It's been a while since I've read the book. I have it sitting on a shelf. It's one of those books I've read enough to where it's falling apart. Well, that, and I've moved around so many times in the last 20 years that a lot of my books have suffered the consequences. But there was a transition where Salvador Dali was removed from the surrealist movement and what was it? I'm not a surrealist. I'm Salvador Dali. I think that was a quote. Anyway, there was a clearly defined difference between early Salvador Dali and later Salvador Dali, and you can see it with this razor sharp focus on realism in his paintings after World War II. There's a tractor outside. My house is right next to a field, and it's planting season. It's awesome. The smell of dirt, especially when it rains, it's freaking awesome. Anyway, there was a clear distinction between early Dali and later Dali, and the Surrealist took this as an offense on their movement, because there was a reason why the work that the Surrealists produced weren't realistic. To clarify, so there is one of my favorite science fiction authors, Alfred Bester. I think it was a forward for one of his anthologies. His intent was to take the craziest, most insane and imaginative story and try to write it to where it was absolutely convincing. To turn something that was completely unrealistic and make it as realistic as he possibly could. He made some brilliant stories, wrote some brilliant stories. The Demolished Man and The Star Is My Destination are two of my absolute favorite science fiction novels. But if you look at the later Salvador Dali work, that's exactly what he did. He used such clear, precise realism to portray the most insane, crazy images, you would almost think that they were computer generated. You look at the advent of AI artwork and computer generated artwork these days, he was doing this stuff in the 50s. The point I'm going to bring up with this is that, generally speaking, and I've noticed this when I was in art school in Florida at the Salvador Dali Museum, there were more people around his later works than there were around his earlier works. And I would gather and I would observe that the general population enjoyed his later works than they did his former works. And it's the distinction between artwork that people can perceive as opposed to artwork they can't. And I think this is an invented division within art. This created elitism in art. In previous videos, I've mocked the jargon in the art world, and it is exactly that. It's jargon. It's all meaningless. It really is profoundly meaningless. And that's weird because it's meaningless, that's its profundity. And how can you identify these things as culturally significant with an idea that because it's absurd and because it's opaque and because it's vague, it is profound? That's not the point. The reason it's profound is because it's understandable, because it's universal. You think to yourself, wow, I would have never have thought about that. And an awful lot of modern art is so detached from the context of the real world, art for the sake of itself, that it loses profundity because of that context, that loss of context. And again, I bring it to the idea that the best artwork doesn't have to have a clear, defined message, and to communicate that clearly defined message. Really, in truth, that's propaganda. You look at propagandist artwork, it has a specific, clearly defined mission, a message, and it's going to communicate that message exactly how it portrays it, however it is, if it's in the movies or it's advertisement or it's a piece of artwork or it's a comic book or a novel or a piece of music. You understand and clearly identify the message that that piece is conveying. And there's good propaganda and there's bad propaganda. You look at the propaganda that's being perpetrated today. You look at the propaganda that was perpetrated in World War II. There's good propaganda and there's bad propaganda. There's beautiful propaganda. An awful lot of communist artwork out of the Soviet Russia was beautiful and robust. It was still propaganda. But it was still art. It was still good art. But it doesn't have to be so opaque and vague that you look at it and say, I don't understand this. Everyone can go to a Salvador Dali painting and see, that's cool. That's cool. I can see that. That's awesome. What was he thinking? That was crazy. That looks awesome. There's something they can pick out of it that they like. And that's what I'm getting at when a piece of artwork has to convey something. It doesn't have to be what the artist intended, but that someone walks away from a piece of artwork having comprehended something, having seen something that they like or they understand and comprehend. And I think that's devoid with most modern artwork. The splatter paintings and the abstract. I think it's decorative art. It's wonderful for decorative art. A Mark Rothko is an awesome piece of decorative art. But I don't see it as great art. If you look at the grand scope of art history through the ages, from the cave paintings, the Renaissance, the Neoclassical period, the Romantic period, even the Impressionists, which I would classify as the last great art movement. There has been no great art movement after the Impressionists. You get this weird detachment in what modern art is. And, this is kind of pointless here, I suppose, because who really cares about what a bunch of pompous punks with millions and millions of dollars do with their millions and millions of dollars? This weird grift, this kind of... I've heard people say that it's money laundering, this bizarre crap, this modern artwork that they sell for ridiculous amounts of money. But that's not what I'm getting at. It's this weird isolation that modern art, and again, this is the abstract crap. This is the stuff that's put in museums and sold for ridiculous money. There's this weird isolation between that artwork and the world as a whole. And that was never the case. Even in the Renaissance, an awful lot of the greatest pieces of artwork were public works. They were tombs. Yeah, they were tombs for kings, but they were presented to the public. They weren't isolated away from the public. The people that paid for it, they were isolated from the public, of course. So this isolation is just a manufactured elitism. And what's weird about it, and this is the thing that's kind of weird about it, this isolation is insulary in that you can have anyone draw brilliantly, masterfully, and they will never ever find themselves within the ranks of these artist elites, because it's not about the artwork. It's about the membership. And it's not a grand conspiracy. I'm not getting into that. There's a culture. It's like the tail wagging the dog. There's a culture that identifies the artwork. It's not the artwork that identifies the culture. Which is a weird inversion, because usually artwork identifies the culture. You look at the neoclassical period. Neoclassical period, there was massive new ideas and political and social designs, the Enlightenment. The Romantic period was similar to that, but it also represented cultural upheavals. It wasn't the same blood sports that were between France, Germany, and Britain throughout centuries and centuries of warfare after the fall of Rome and through the Dark Ages. It was cultural revolutions, the Enlightenment, the idea of individual liberties, the idea of commerce, the idea that people could make wealth on their own without having to be inherited this wealth. I'm spitballing. It's just thinking out loud, this weird isolation from the world at large of what should be culturally relevant. And I don't think much of modern art is culturally relevant. It's not. Is it relevant to you? Is it relevant to me? Well, it's relevant enough that I'm talking about it here. But it's not in the grand scale of things. You look at the Sistine Chapel. That's relevant today, centuries after it was created. Something to think about. Anyway, thank you for watching and listening. Till next time.